Good afternoon and welcome to the Hedgehog Noon Discussion. I'm Jay Tolson, editor of the Hedgehog Review, a print and online journal dedicated to the study of cultural change in the modern world, published by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at UVA. I am also the host of today's session, addressing a topic very central to the Institute's concerns: genealogies of modernity. Our featured guest and speaker today is Ryan McDermott, Associate Professor of Medieval Literature and Culture at the University of Pittsburgh and Director of the cross-disciplinary multi-institutional Genealogies of Modernity project. He's the author of Tropologies, Ethics, and Invention in England, 1350 to 1600. He is currently working on a book provisionally titled Genealogies: How to Think About the Past and the Future in the Humanities. The wearer of several hats, Ryan is founder and research fellow of the Beatrice Institute, an ecumenical research community. And I am delighted to say he is currently a fellow here at the Institute. What is genealogy? And particularly, what is genealogy as an analytical tool or framework for the study of culture, traditions, religions, structures, and systems of belief? Genealogy has become shorthand for a feature of critical history that, in the words of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, entails going behind the institution and trying to discover what we can broadly call a technology of power. As a method of critical history, it is often associated, somewhat incorrectly, Ryan argues, with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and particularly his book on the genealogy of morals. In addition to being associated with thinkers like Nietzsche and Foucault, genealogy has become associated with an outlook or disposition of skepticism and suspicion in the academic fields. Thus, employed or understood, genealogy assumes that the family tree of some institution or idea or practice is a fraudulent fabrication, and the genealogist's job is to reveal the ignobility of origins. But there are other uses of genealogy besides tracing noble or ignoble heritage. Today, in addition to correcting some of our misconceptions about supposed practitioners of genealogy, Ryan will be explaining other uses of this intellectual tool, uses that might enrich our approaches to humanistic studies and, in turn, our understandings of culture and ourselves. Ryan, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Jay. Thanks, everyone, for being here on your lunch hour. I have some slides that I'll be sharing with you here, so let me get those going. All right. Can you all see this slideshow? Jay, let me know if you can. Not yet. How about now? Yes. Good.
We're seeing some, yeah, there.
Oh, there we go. All right. Thanks. So, as Jay said, I direct this project called Genealogies of Modernity, and I want to just introduce that project a little bit to start off. We have a website that houses the things that we do. The main thing on that website is a journal that publishes short pieces that our wonderful editors get academics to speak outside their disciplines. So the goal is for multiple disciplines to speak to each other and communicate in about 1,000 to 1,500 word entertaining, well-written essays. And we publish about 2 essays a week. So it's not peer-reviewed, but it's fast and it's wide-ranging, and I call your attention to it. Once a month, we publish a feature called Pathways, where we link to genealogies of modernity related work. Here are some examples from some time ago. And we have a podcast. There is a first season that's interview podcast, but coming up, starting in the first week of November, we'll have a second season, which is a much bigger production. It was funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities media production grant. It's been 2.5 years in the making, and it'll be in 8 narrative episodes, each of which takes up a lesser known but fairly commonly understood story of what it means to be modern and how we got here. One example is the mountain climbing and the idea that Petrarch became the first modern man by climbing a mountain. Another example is the formation of the colonial racial imagination in Costa paintings in colonial Mexico. And so we take up these kind of smaller stories in much bigger narratives about modernity, and be on the lookout for it. So these are, we also, the Beatrice Institute podcast, which is an interview podcast. I run a thread of that called Genealogies of Modernity, where I interview scholars working on questions of how we came to be modern. And so, you know, these are some recent episodes that might be of interest. Okay, so turning then to my work, this year I'm working on a monograph on genealogy as a master analogy for the study of the past in the humanities. Now, genealogy means a bunch of different things. The literal genealogy can mean a lot of different things, from family trees to DNA testing. And then when you apply it analogically to the study of the past more broadly, it can mean even more things. So just a few comments about options here before we narrow down. So in the broadest sense, a genealogy of modernity is a big story about how something distinctively modern came to be. Something like science with a capital S, or capitalism, or democracy. Genealogy is fundamentally an account of descent with modification. That's a quote from Darwin. And genealogies of the past seek to understand how a lineage changes over the course of generations. Now, you might be asking, if these are big stories, why not call them histories of modernity? And there certainly are histories of modernity. But genealogy is a different way of thinking about the past. The analogy itself does different work. So if we think about history, it relies on an analogy to story. And stories have characters who make choices and act, often acting in order to resolve a conflict. That gives us a plot, which have plots have beginnings, middles, and ends. So drawing an analogy to genealogy for the study of the past is often a reaction, I think, to the privileging of individual will and action in the story analogy of history. So to substitute the language of genealogy for the language of history is often to say, you can choose your actions, but you can't choose your ancestors. And as a way of studying the past, then, genealogy privileges what we can't control. It privileges what we can only inherit. And there are many kinds of genealogy, but I'm going to focus right now on 4 ways of studying the past that have a genealogical structure. So first kind, evolutionary genealogy, which tends to tell a narrative of progress, or evolutionary genealogies understand history as progress. This bestseller, Bill Gates' favorite book of all time, tries to vindicate modernity and promises that if we just stick with the enlightened technocrats, we will be on our way to universal peace and prosperity. Steven Pinker is an evolutionary psychologist, and he believes that humanity is evolving toward perfection. Another example of a progressive or evolutionary genealogy is this book by Shakespeare scholar Stephen Greenblatt. It was the only nonfiction book thus far to win both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. And these types of stories tend to trace modernity back to a noble origin of revolution against the pre-modern Dark Ages. Then as a kind of flip side of that, we have declinist or declension narratives, declinist genealogies. And here are a couple examples related to my primary field of study. These intellectual histories trace a particular lineage of descent with modification. So for Henri de Lubac's study of medieval exegesis, once upon a time, the disciplines of theology, philosophy, and biblical studies were integrated around scriptural interpretation. And then gradually he traces how those disciplines disintegrated, gained autonomy, and eventually led to the ascendancy of scientific historical criticism. It turns out in these narratives that much of what's wrong with modernity can be traced back to bad ideas in the medieval or early modern period, which is what got me interested in these kinds of stories to begin with. Then there's critical genealogy, and critical genealogy starts with the premise that what we're doing as academics is not primary genealogy, it's a kind of secondary genealogy. So, and it's premised on the idea that when most people do genealogy, they are fabricating, they're coming up with some kind of fond fabrication. And so here's an example I just came across this morning in Werner Herzog's wonderful new memoir, and hopefully this audio will play so you can hear his voice.
My family tree never especially interested me, but I remember my father conducting inquiries that established that we were related to the mathematician Gauss and various other historical figures, including Charlemagne, but presumably that would be true of most Germans and French. The truth is that my father was more interested in finding a significance for us that we didn't possess.
So the truth that Herzog is interested in is the truth about what his father is trying to do. It's not the truth of the ancestors themselves. And that tends to be the starting point for the analogy that critical genealogy begins with. It's most commonly associated with Michel Foucault, and he explicitly called his method of historical philosophy genealogy. And for one example, he'd take a modern phenomenon like the psychiatric hospital, which claims to care for the mentally ill, and then trace it back to show that its origins were not care for the ill, but the violent assertion of the power of reason at the expense of people who in the Middle Ages would have been included in society as saints or fools. Foucault's genealogy takes an institution's claims to noble origins and unmasks them as ignoble and products of the will to power. But I also have a more charitable reading of Foucault that doesn't depend as much on his early Nietzsche essay, but rather his later work. And I think that actually there is in Foucault, we can find a kind of hermeneutic of historical contingency oriented to limit cases where new capabilities can emerge through new and different relations within and among institutions, communities, and individuals. And so part of what we do when we study the past is to look for opportunities for these kinds of reconfigurations. So this Foucault is not only critical, but also constructive and creative. Now, however, I think whenever Foucault reaches these points, he quickly steps back from the brink, and the closest he comes to sustained constructive genealogy is in the late lectures on truth and subjectivity, which explore the capabilities afforded by ancient ascetical practices that he suggests might be possible, available to us today. And whereas though he steps back and doesn't really take those up, you can see how, in something like the work of his friend Pierre Hadot, you can see what that might look like to take up aesthetical practices as a philosophy, as a way of life in the 20th century. So I think Foucault was cramped and a bit confused by his analogies to genealogy. And part of what I'm trying to do in this book project is to return to the literal practices of genealogy and start the analogy afresh from some of those literal practices to allow us to better develop the affordances of genealogical thinking. So trying to refresh the analogy and take up some of these suggestive moves in Foucault's later work, take up some what I think are really promising moves in Nietzsche's early work, and then also looking at opportunities for genealogical thinking from other time periods. So one place where I've gone for this is biblical genealogy. One example of refreshing the analogy of genealogical disposition to the past could start with the Bible, and in particular, in my work, the medieval genealogies of Christ. This is an example of a kind of illustrated medieval genealogy of Christ, where you have the Lucan account of the genealogy running across the top of the page and the Matthean account running across the bottom of the page. They meet in that right-hand illustration with the birth of Christ. They've been preceded by 18 pages of this, and in between, in the middle, what we've had is a commentary that interlaces various nodes of the genealogy, various figures in the genealogy, with the broader story of the history of salvation. So when we look at biblical genealogy, one thing that it immediately impresses on us is that genealogy is an interpretive practice. It's not just an act of record keeping. And a classic example here is that the Matthean genealogy of Christ has women, unlike most other biblical and contemporary genealogies. Its emphasis is on non-Jewish sinful women in Jesus's genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, and these build up to the citation of Mary as the mother of Jesus. The implicit argument then being, and all genealogies have arguments, is that Gentiles have always been involved in salvation history. Women have always been essential to the history of redemption. Salvation comes by faith, not birth or ethnicity. Matthew also supports the Davidic succession with some innovative quirks. So Matthew works from the past toward Jesus, from ancestors to descendant. Matthew establishes Jesus as the prophesied heir to the Davidic throne through genealogical proof. Now, Luke reverses this and works from Jesus back to the past in order to destabilize human genealogy. The first link is already placed under erasure. He's the son of Joseph as people thought. And it concludes with who was of Adam, who was of God. So it jumps the rails of human genealogy, and the argument seems to be God is really the father of Jesus, not any of these intermediate humans. So this reflects Christianity's suspicion of genealogy. We see this in 1 Timothy 1:4, links genealogies to myths or stories, subjects of fruitless speculation that lead to heterodoxy. Same also in Titus 3:9. And what's fascinating about these biblical genealogies is that many points, the function of genealogy is to demonstrate the contrast between hereditary continuity and providential election when God reaches in and disrupts human lineage. And so an important frame to Paul's cautions about genealogies in 1 Timothy and Titus is that Paul explicitly characterizes himself as a spiritual father and identifies Timothy and Titus as his spiritual sons. This defies conventional genealogy. It consigns biological heredity to the realm of myth, as opposed to the truth of spiritual heritage that comes by way of election and adoption. You could, if you wanted to, map this on to a kind of Foucauldian critical genealogy that's taking a standard human account of lineage, disrupting it, and showing how it has its own intrinsic motivations and desires, but in fact, there is a truer account, one that doesn't rely on a particular pedigree. So we encounter both linear genealogy and God's prerogative to disrupt linear genealogy in the medieval genealogies of Christ. You find these at the beginning of many Bible manuscripts. They run Matthew and Luke genealogies parallel to each other. And all along, the text is commenting on each of the figures in the genealogy, offering etymologies of names and allegorical correspondences. The commentary frequently explains the Christological significance of some event, which forces it to jump out of the chronology and forward in history. But at the same time, we've got families marrying into this lineage, connecting in from the side, as it were. So there's really, despite the fact that you can trace a lineage across the top or bottom of the page, it's constantly, the form of this genealogy is constantly complicating that and disrupting the linear progression with these allegorical jumps and with various marriages and other alliances. So the combination of linear and sideways motion comes clear in phylogenetic diagrams. A tree captures the branching of a lineage, but it can't represent the intersection of lineages, what biogeneticists call interbreeding. And this is just a fundamental part of biological reproduction. And a tree can't account for it. So for that, we need a reticulating network. It's a diagram that does not just branch, but also connects branches to each other. The main function of trees and reticulated networks in phylogenetics is to simplify complex network relations. Computers are capable of mapping networks of intricate complexity, but the networks they are able to produce are often far too complex to be of much use as a representation of the data, according to phylogeneticist Morrison. Trees and reticulated networks both facilitate simplified representations of genetic relations within data sets. So if we apply these principles to genealogy in historical disciplines, we'll recognize that insofar as there are genetic relationships among historical phenomena, these relations are intractably complex. But instead of concluding with a demonstration of complexity, as do so many works of humanistic inquiry, we should recognize the utility of simplifying models and consider the affordances and limitations of tree and reticulated network analogies. Among these considerations should be whether it's more important to conceptualize continuity or change. Genealogical trees usually track the continuity of a single lineage, whereas reticulated networks track the merging of multiple lineages. a hybridization that can be continuous or disruptive, depending on the principles of legitimacy the interpreter applies. And it turns out that medieval genealogists were very aware of these dimensions. Medieval trees of consanguinity were built to visualize both tree and reticulated network topology. Trees of consanguinity converted genealogical data from simple to complex relations, much like the phylogenetic method for converting between a median network and a parsimony tree. So preceding many genealogies of Christ are in these Bible manuscripts are these diagrams called trees of consanguinity, and I'll explain how it works in a moment, but first let's consider how odd the conventional family tree is. The modern family tree presents genealogical data counterintuitively and simplistically. In a typical family tree, I am placed at the root while my ancestors illogically branch out above me. It's a perfect example in phylogenetic terms of mistaking a reticulated network for a tree. Furthermore, the rootedness of the diagram belies the intricate reticulation of multiple lineages with each other. High medieval genealogical diagrams resisted this counterintuitive arrangement. And so I'm going to play a 4-minute video now that explains how these diagrams work.
We often think of family trees as static representations of our own ancestry. But our family relations are in constant motion as new generations are born and marriages are formed or dissolved. For this reason, genealogy is best visualized dynamically. Unlike modern family trees, which are static, medieval trees of consanguinity were designed to be imagined in motion. Consanguinity means blood relationship. This medieval diagram was used to visualize the degrees of separation among relatives. It was useful for thinking through issues of inheritance and succession, as well as marriage. Relatives in all but the outermost boxes of the diagram were not permitted to marry. You've probably heard the phrase 6 degrees of separation. This is its origin. Beyond 6 degrees of separation, it was permissible for cousins to marry. The outer fringe of the tree holds relations of the 7th degree. Beyond 6 degrees, relations became kissing cousins. I am at the center of the tree. Above me are my parents and grandparents. Below me are my son and daughter, and below them, my grandchildren, and so on, up and down the trunk of the tree. Moving out sideways into the branches are uncles and aunts, first cousins, children of first cousins, grandchildren of first cousins, and on out to their grandchildren. The tree of consanguinity is a diagram that you fill in with your own family. Even as new generations are born, it stays the same size and shape, but its contents are in motion. When a new generation is born, the parents become the grandparents, and so on. Each new generation bumps the 6th degree out to the 7th degree. And because 7th degree relations can marry, they potentially become the origins of their own trees of consanguinity. The 7th degree is also the 0 degree, the me at the middle of the tree. Nearly all of these medieval diagrams are accompanied by commentary that invites readers to imagine the contents of the tree in motion. One manuscript notes that the tree gradually unrolls within itself until it goes along to the extremities, right up to the 6th degree. At this point, all relationship ceases completely. Unions are allowed, and thus marriage is restored. Medieval trees of consanguinity help us to see how we are constantly passing into and out of significant relationship with other individuals. To see the tree in motion, as medieval scribes intended, shows us that every origin is also a peripheral node in many other overlapping trees. When I think of my own genealogy, I am the culmination of my ancestry and the origin of all my descendants. But when I see the tree in motion, I realize that I am also just a leaf on many other people's trees. The medieval tree of consanguinity helps us see that linear descent is less important than the proximity and distance of relations. Genealogy, it turns out, is relative. This video is part of the Genealogies of Modernity project. Check out our blog, podcast, and other activities at Genealogies of Modernity.
Okay, so these reflections help us see the complexity of a complete genealogical identity. If you imagine that, if you imagine your own place within a vast genealogical web, you would see that you can't grasp your own complete identity while you're alive. What this concept of your complete or total genealogical or genetic identity is called the gen identity, and it's not complete until your descendants have passed through 6 degrees of relation. So I would be potentially implicated in 84 trees of consanguinity, and even more if any descendant has more than one son or daughter. So this is just a kind of diagram hinting at the complexity of actual what an actual genealogical tree might look like if we were to exhaustively diagram it. So to sum up, the genealogy of historical phenomena would seem to be intractably complex. For this very reason, though, genealogical inquiry is important. The current tendency of historical scholarship to conclude by demonstrating complexity is not a particularly hard-won conclusion. The analogy between the tree of consanguinity and genealogical method in the humanities presents a challenge to historical inquiry. To represent the complexity of relations among historical phenomena, while also identifying and interpreting significant proximity and the dynamics of passing into and out of significant proximity. So thinking genealogically is not just about descent with modification. It's not just about how one thing led to the next. It can be just as much about measuring how distant or different one cultural formation is from another. And it's also about looking for opportunities for the union or reunion of estranged or rival family lines. This is a mode of genealogy that I'm calling creative genealogy, and it uses what we might call the nuptial imagination. So looking to the past, not in order to explain how we got here and why we're stuck here, nor to unmask the will to power in a rival version of history, but to look for opportunities of reconciliation, of union, of new beginnings. And so I want to leave you with just a few preliminary axioms that this inquiry so far has turned up for me. And I want to state very baldly for the sake, for the opportunity of disputation. So proximity and distance between historical phenomena are important factors in understanding the relationships. At some point of distance between two phenomena, relation is no longer significant. Just because we can identify a genetic relationship between two historical phenomena, such as the doctrine of metaphysical univocity and TikTok, doesn't mean that the relationship is one of significant proximity. It's also possible to pass back into significant relation at a later date after passing out of significant relation. Significant proximity will be determined by purpose and convention. So just as marriage, inheritance, and aristocratic succession depended on different rules of proximity, so also will different disciplines and methodologies, such as jurisprudence, literary history, history of science, apply different rules of proximity depending on their various purposes. A genealogical relation can be configured in many ways depending on what is taken as the origin point. Genealogical relation depends as much on the future as it does on the past. We cannot grasp the gen identity of any present phenomenon during our lifetime. even though we might be tempted to. Genealogical relation is always in motion. Because of the limitation on significant proximity, the variation of genealogical relation is not infinite, but the range of motion within even a limited tree of consanguinity entails substantial complexity. Okay, so I can say more about various ways that I think this affects our ideas about tradition, but I'm going to stop there and open it up for discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Ryan. That's a lot to to digest. And I tried to do some pre-digestion before this gathering today. But I would sort of, what I would like to do is ask one very quick question is, if you say the dominant tenor of the humanities in the recent academy has been critical genealogy, a sort of an attitude of suspicion and skepticism, is the kind of genealogical approach that you favor, looking for more positive and affirmative connections, at odds with that critical, suspicious, negative? I mean, you talked about Foucault as somebody who, at least in particularly his later work, tried to be a little more constructive, but ultimately seemed to back away from that. Is this sort of what is the assumption behind, if there is an assumption behind wanting to demonstrate or assert or prove a positive sort of genealogical connection, if that makes any sense to you? And that will be my last question for the time being. Then I'll ask others too, starting with Isaac Reed. But if that question makes any sense, fire away, Ryan.
Yeah, definitely. There's always going to be a place for critical genealogy. It's just that that's what we all know how to do. We can do it in our sleep. And what's hard for us is to look for opportunities for new beginnings, for reconciliations. And so, a great example of this is the sociologist Alondra Nelson started to study DNA-based genealogy among African American communities. And she says that she started out looking for kind of with this suspicious critical approach, and there's plenty to find there. I mean, you can see how the DNA data has made its way into police databases, and which has resulted in mistaken arrests and so on. You can do a whole critical genealogy in that way, but she found that what interested her more was the way that these consumers were using African Ancestry Inc. Testing to cross the black box that is the Middle Passage, and to reunite with identities. Some of the stories she tells in particular go back to origins in Sierra Leone, and which now has a citizenship program for Americans who can demonstrate DNA ancestry to the region, Sierra Leonean region of Africa. So, and she says that she found that this was the work that the consumers themselves wanted to see happening. And that's the work that she ended up following as a scholar. And she describes how difficult that was to make that switch and learn how to do that. So that's what I think the challenge for us all is to figure out what are these opportunities.
Thank you. I would follow up on that, but I'm going to hold to my word and ask Isaac Reed, who is a fellow here also at the Institute and the director of the Modernity Project here, to take a turn. Isaac.
Great, thanks, Jay. And Ryan, thanks for, what is really, frankly, a just fascinating project and a wonderful presentation of it. And I'm really excited about this book. Of course, I agree with your interpretation of sort of what's going on in Foucault and in his later works and his attempts to maybe get outside the particular version of genealogy that he articulated in that essay. I find that argument really compelling. I think my question is maybe for the larger project, and would ask you actually to speak a little bit more about the genealogies of Christ and the sort of middle part of your presentation. The theoretical way I want to term my question is, what is the relationship between genealogy and interpretation? And in particular, what I guess one way that I have tended to view as like an off-ramp from the discourse of suspicion would be something like the hermeneutic tradition and Hans Georg Gadamer, and the notion that, you know, every reading or argument about a text or an institution occurs as, you know, as part of a long chain of readings of readings of readings. Foucault, in some of his earlier phases, famously attacked hermeneutics as sort of insufficient, and said, I think, you know, well, we've been waiting for a commentary on the word for a long time and it's never come, so we're going to do something else. But I wanted to kind of ask about this because it strikes me that there might be many ways in which one might get outside. You know, you mentioned sort of the moment that sort of God reaches in and creates something different, as something that disrupts sort of standard patriarchal genealogies that we know from Tanakh, right? And that's interesting. But I would sort of ask, isn't it also the case that recombination and reinterpretation of stories might also be sort of way to do this? And I just don't quite understand what the relationship is between hermeneutics on the one hand and genealogy. And one thing that you said, I'll just end with this. I mean, it's really interesting. You sort of said that this thing at the end about present and, you know, the past, present, and the future, and that we don't know what the real meaning of a genealogy is until our lives are over, et cetera. And I would argue that a hermeneutic perspective would come to exactly the same conclusion about action. In fact, it's almost exactly what Hannah Arendt says about action in the human condition. She basically says, well, we're all in the business of acting in the world and creating some kind of story about the meaning of our life, but we in fact don't get to know the ultimate significance of our story. You know, only historians who tell the story of our lives, or our families who tell the story of our lives, will be able to like actually say something about the significance. So it's very interesting to me that what you are ascribing to constructive genealogy, which I think I agree with, we might also ascribe to action and to history itself. So I guess my thought is just, do you have any sort of thoughts on the sort of philosophy of interpretation? In the sense that I guess the way I would put this is, you know, there is something about genealogy where you identify parents and children and you kind of link them in, and then you kind of know what the moving network is. But of course there might, you know, interpretation might be more, let's say, ambiguous or something like that. So that's I understand that that's a lot of set of thoughts, but I really am intrigued by where something like, say, biblical hermeneutics might find a place in the middle of your presentation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I love it. So what's the, you know, I take it to be the substance of the question, what's the difference between hermeneutics and genealogy? And if genealogy is attending to the open-endedness of historical phenomena, and also to my kind of version of creative genealogy is particularly oriented to not the limitations of the ancestors, but also to what we can do through making choices in the present and so on. And so I think there's a huge overlap there. It has a lot to do with the section of the book that I'm writing on tradition. But I would say one of the basic differences is that hermeneutics is oriented towards meaning and understanding, whereas genealogy as a method of inquiry into the past is oriented toward that question of continuity and change over time. So there is always going to be this linear dimension of genealogy. As much as I'm stressing the horizontal, the way that lineages combine and recombine, there's still going to be that vertical linear dimension where we are asking generationally, how have things changed and stayed the same, which is something that hermeneutics doesn't do as a primary operation. Now, of course, hermeneutics is going to get into these questions, but I think that the two are very closely allied,
right.
And and I'll have to ask you off camera about Foucault's challenges to hermeneutics, because I don't know those texts.
Yeah. Well, just a quick follow-up. I mean, I think it's a brilliant point, because I agree that I think that in hermeneutics, let's say something like in hermeneutics, doing a generational hermeneutics would be a very specific choice.
Right.
That would be like a very specific hermeneutic by which to read readings of texts, which would be, I'm going to group them by generation and say, well, that this generation interpreted this biblical story different than this other one. So it would be a very specific choice, where there's something about genealogy which makes it kind of emphasizes that generational change is a kind of inevitability that we don't in fact have. We don't get to make generational choice if in the genealogical point of view, whereas there's no reason why hermeneutics has to be generational. It would maybe be like a particular kind of hermeneutics. And I think that's a brilliant point, and I think it's very interesting to think about genealogy as maybe in a very good way, compelling us to grapple with the inevitability of generational change or something like that, and continuity. Whereas, not all, I agree, not all hermeneutics are generational. In fact, some of them maybe try to reject it by getting back to the original text, or something like that. So it's a wonderful comment. So thanks. I've learned a lot from this presentation.
Thank you, Isaac. I see a number of hands going up, and I'm going to try to call people in the order in which they appeared, also favoring probably the people who are not here. I guess one thing I would like to pursue with you, Ryan, later would be, there's much talk about the invention of tradition, and it seems that the creative genealogy lends itself very neatly, maybe too neatly, to the inventions of tradition. I mean, for good and ill. I think of a lot of Islamist movements draw on what they claim are these sort of genealogical sort of cross-fertilizations, but we can pursue at other times. I think let's see, Jose Ambrosic, if I say your name correctly, you are certainly not here, and you should ask a question, please. You have to unmute. There you go.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Certainly, it blows my mind a little bit, because I'm not familiar with a number of the concepts that were displayed. But something that struck me very interesting is this opportunity for reconciliation. And I'd like to mention the work of a Peruvian thinker and diplomat, Víctor Andrés Belaunde. He was for a while president of the United Nations, and he has this interesting theory about how cultures relate to each other, and very unlike most versions that are conflictive in the sense of a clash of cultures or cultures overpowering or being tyrannical with others, or even something that's very common in Latin America, thinking of how the Spanish culture kind of oppress the indigenous cultures, which are constantly trying to subvert or survive. And so there's this implies, of course, this whole logic of oppressor and oppress, and the notion that the oppressed has this moral high ground versus the oppressor, and so on. But he says that more what happens is a synthesis of cultures, where cultures relate to each other. Of course, might be some conflict, but there's a lot of being able to accept and bring into your culture what the other culture brings. And eventually there's a synthesis that in a way it's more organic and not necessarily conflictive, but rather creative, even to the point I'm not only about like intermarriage, but in a number of cultural aspects that are considered valuable and of course taken into the receiving culture. And the other way around. I mean, the Spaniards took a lot of things from the Incas. A curious example that eventually found its way to the U.S. is that jerky is a word that comes from the original charqui, which is the way that the Incas talked about the dried meat that they used to conserve. So anyway, I think trying to not always bring things into the conflictive and oppressive mindset, but rather a more reconciliated, and even, I mean, looking at history, a more positive outlook in terms of how cultures relate to each other might also serve as a way to solve this issue of cultural appropriation, which in a synthesis doesn't make any sense, because you actually embrace whatever the other culture has of value, and that's something positive. It's even a way of recognizing and honoring the value of the other culture.
Yeah, this is wonderful, because it actually relates directly to one of the forthcoming podcast episodes that we have, which is my colleague, the art historian Chris Nygren, produced this episode about Costa paintings, which are these paintings that would often come in a grid of 16 that show, in the upper left-hand corner, it shows a Spaniard, a Spanish man and Spanish woman, and their child, and that is a picture of racial purity. And then it works its way on down through various forms of racial mixing, all the way down to the bottom quadrant, which is which is like a mestizo marrying an African slave, and their non-free, non-white offspring. And so it applies this Enlightenment taxonomy to race and depicts it. And this is really one of the origins of modern conceptions of race that depend on skin color and pigmentation. But fascinatingly, when the curator of the largest collection of Costa paintings in the US created an exhibit at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, she created all of this interpretive work that was coming at it from a very critical perspective, rightly so. But then as people started to come through the exhibition, she found that a prominent reaction was people saying, "Oh, that looks like us. That looks like my family of mixed race, mixed origin." And they were actually identifying with these pictures that were originally created as instruments of oppression. And then we actually find that in the cases where we can trace the identity of the artists, it's fairly rare, but we can in certain cases. It turns out that the artists themselves were probably of mixed race. And what they're presenting there, if you take each of these individual vignettes, they're actually these pretty loving portrayals of a marital relationship between a man and a woman, and their nurturing love for their child. And so there's this way that the mixing, as you say, Jose, is being, it can be oppressive, but then it's also there's something new, some kind of new identity and new union that's being presented out of that.
Thank you. I think Catherine Moon.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks. This was so great. I just had maybe two questions about sort of like an event is the way I keep framing it in my mind. So, right, like what happens when in a family tree, the most distinctive figure is someone further out, if that makes sense. So how does an event or a kind of stronger figure from maybe the like fifth or sixth rungs, fourth rungs, how does that influence the genealogy and how we understand it? And maybe another way of getting at this is if we look at the other gospels, so if we look at Mark and we look at John, those don't have traditional genealogies, obviously, but they do have, I think it could be argued they have genealogies in the sense of they have a genesis point and what they identify as a genesis point. And with Mark, we get it with the event of baptism. And then with John, we get it sort of more towards the eternal dimension rather than the finite or historical dimension. And so maybe this is a hermeneutical question again, but yeah, so I was wondering how events or particular dominant figures work out in this system, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, my first response would just be to say that events are that's the domain of history, and let's let history take care of that, and let genealogy work with the kind of relatively simpler progression of generational change. So when we get the narrative aspect, that's where we want to draw on all of the narrative tools of history. So that would be one response. Another, though, is just that there are genealogies are constantly being disrupted by events, and most human genealogical systems that I'm aware of account for these. So adoption is one of these, right? Adoption is an event. It's a juridical interruption of the biological process, and yet it's integrated into and fitted into the genealogical system. And so there's definitely a sense in which genealogy is a narrower way of approaching history. And that's why I think we always need to just be asking, what are the affordances and limitations of deploying genealogy? Is it really the tool we want to use, or do we want to approach things in a more fulsome narrative kind of way?
Jonathan, and then Paul Nedolitsky. Jonathan Teubner.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you very much for this really fascinating press board, particularly the way in which it introduces more dynamism within this. I guess I'm kind of like intrigued. I mean, most of my work kind of largely falls into something called vaguely intellectual history. And I work a lot with like concepts of influence, tradition, and things like that, trying to understand it. And I guess one thing that I've puzzled with, and I just asking it, just more, kind of naively, is how to deal with something like betrayal, intellectual betrayal, and leaving a tradition. And I guess within this context of like thinking about it through these family trees, particularly this medieval one, which is, I think you've made a very persuasive case that this is a helpful way to think about it. But I guess when the way I would go is like, well, I really care about these intellectual genealogies ultimately. And so, but what we kind of deal with is someone who studies with someone and then seems to like want to leave that tradition. And whether or not we like actually allow them to, or we like always stamp them as if like you're always going to be this scholar's son or daughter or something like that, and whether there's dynamism within that, that actually you can have real breaking and fracturing and putting this back together. So those are just, it's just a pretty general question, but I'd love to hear how you kind of handle that or think about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, tradition tradition does a good job. The conceptuality of tradition does a good job of handling that in and of itself, because I mean, just etymologically, tradition means not only handing down but betraying, handing over. And so there's both of those dynamics of like the continuity and the disruption in a tradition, and you find that in I think modern accounts of the way that tradition works, at least in Christianity, that there's a real sense that traditions run on conflict. So it's necessary that there be a sustained conflict over agreed upon questions, but it's these conflicts and these perceived betrayals that actually kind of generate the tradition and keep it alive and so on. But I think that what a kind of nuptial imagination can do is it can actually be attuned to these times where there has been a rupture, there has been a break back in history, maybe centuries ago, and that break was the result of a kind of feud, and yet the passions that drove that feud have cooled, and it may now be the case that a new union can be formed. And one example of this from Christian church history is the Council of Florence in 1415, where at least on paper, East and West were reconciled, and you had this healing of a 400-year-old schism in the church. Now that it turned out that when they tried to do this literally and send five daughters of Florentine nobles over to Constantinople and have them married to Constantinopolitan princes, those marriages did not go well and became one of the reasons that the whole thing blew up. So you have to be attuned to whether the distance and the proximity are actually right for the moment. But I would see that as being a case where this kind of historical nuptial imagination has prospects to do work.
Thank you. Paul Nedeliski.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Ryan, for this really interesting presentation. My question, I'm still trying to get clear on how you're thinking about genealogy, and maybe especially in how you're trying to contrast that with what you're calling history. Maybe one way to get at it is in the kind of the simple trees of contiguity examples you've given. It's kind of simple. Despite the complexity in one way, the relationships between the nodes is pretty well defined. It's like genetic succession or something. But what are the causal relationships between the successive generations more generally, or what can they be? Because I think about cases like in the Renaissance, some interpretations of what happened is that people in the Mediterranean, North Mediterranean at this time, they became impressed and they sort of reevaluated the aesthetic value of art and texts that were 1,500 years old. And they felt that by comparison, the cultural artifacts of their age were they didn't measure up. And so, there was this rebirth of interest. And so there's this, in a way, this something like a causal relationship that goes way back. There was, if you want to understand why there was a change between these generations, you can't just look to the previous generation in the way that you would with a family tree. You got to jump back way farther. And it's coming from these cultural artifacts from long ago. And some of your responses to some of the questions made me think you would say, well, that's now you're doing history. I guess I'm wondering why. What constrains the relationships that count some changes from generation to generation or from one time to another time as genealogical and others as some kind of merely historical narrative?
Right. Well, I think so. One of the reasons that the lateral or horizontal or sideways action of genealogies fascinates me so much is because this is the part that breaks out of our dominant linear vertical modern historical imagination, and so that's where I would see phenomena like Petrarch discovering all these old classical manuscripts and deciding that he's going to learn how to read them and translate them and fashion his own poetry after them. That I see that as one of these lateral unions. And so it's not actually, I don't see that as reaching back in time, because I see with this kind of approach to the past is always with us. The past is always available. Now it's available in limited modalities. What manuscripts happen to survive is going to delimit what's available to us. But the past remains with us. And so part of what we're doing, especially in this new podcast series, is really finding a lot of concrete examples of how the past has remained available, and how we're not just locked into our one lineage and generation, but actually there are these other kinds of opportunities that remain with us and alive. The past isn't dead; it's alive and it's available for new relationships.
But it sounds like you're saying it's not reaching back, but at the same time, you're trying to illustrate that we're not locked into the present moment. That I don't know why not say we're reaching back? Why not say that for some of these Renaissance thinkers, the context of interpretation from the time in which these artifacts were created was important and valuable. Maybe not in every case, but they were drawing on this ancient culture to inform their own. And sure, their only means of accessing that was through existing artifacts. But I guess why restrict it, the sort of the causal connection, or causal is too strong, but the connection of influence to the present moment?
Do you mean well, I mean,
I guess where the rubber meets the road.
How can we get out of the present moment?
No, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a sense of this thing that happened long ago now has influence because it has persisted through artifacts in this then present moment. Just because if that's permitted, then the barrier between what you're calling genealogy and what you're wanting to call historical narrative, to me, seems to erode substantially. There's this hermeneutic aspect in genealogy itself, and we just sort of have a strange fracturing of the kind of this generation, then this generation, this generation. These nodes are going back not just laterally, but to these prior moments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to run the analogy too strictly, and I have no problem with the analogy of genealogy as an approach to the past, eroding into history as an approach to the past. That gambit I find is helpful just as a way to just as a kind of hypothesis for why it is that so much of the humanities wants to say they're doing genealogy rather than say they're doing history. But I don't want to, methodologically draw a strict line between the two.
I see a written question, or the beginning of a written question on the meeting chat from Matthew Williams. I didn't know if Matthew had a question that he would like to ask before I come back. I think, Jose, were you intending to ask another question? Just nod and let me, I'll come back to you, but I did want to call on Matthew if he had a question. Matthew, if you're still with us, was that a question? If not, then we will go back to Jose. Jose, go ahead and ask.
Okay, part of my work has to deal with human ecology as put forth by John Paul II and developed by Pope Benedict, and human ecology in the sense that not only the natural, but also the cultural, the society. So, for example, something toxic in the culture would be materialism, or let's say things that are not so consistent with human nature as at least we understand in the Catholic tradition. And going into that, I want to see, okay, there's an influence that the culture has on the person, but then even within the culture, there's family cultures. So ultimately, my choices or my view of life and are shaped by the culture I was born in, but also by my family culture. And I was thinking about the genealogies because, like, for example, my father was Slovenian and he went to South America after the Second World War and married a Peruvian, which is absolutely mixed breed of everything. And so, but the curious thing is my father came with a cousin and they married two sisters. So there were two first cousins married two sisters. So very much similar DNA, similar culture, but our families, mine and the one of my cousins, are totally different in the way we approach life. And so I'm interested in seeing how much is like DNA, how much is culture, and even also how you shape your own identity in the sense of, and that's where freedom comes, where you interpret yourself according to what you learn or decide about your family history. For example, my father came out as a refugee from the massacres that occurred in Slovenia right after the war finished. And so that changed the way I looked at my own history and my own sense of who I am. But for example, if I was French, or if my father were French, and I took pride in the French Revolution, then that might limit my capacity to embrace a more faithful approach in my relationship with God. So I wonder how those genealogies of DNA, of culture, and also of my own choices of how I interpret my origins can kind of combine to shape the way my identity allows me to look at what my purpose or my decisions will be.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what. So my book isn't really getting into this, but this is where I think the genealogy's emphasis on what it is that we inherit, that we don't have a choice over, is so powerful today. And so the philosopher Amiya Srinivasan has written a number of essays on what she calls genealogical anxiety. And essentially, ancestry is an embarrassment, or heredity is an embarrassment to the modern autonomous subject. It's an embarrassment to liberal reason. And Srinivasan is like keenly aware of that, and she's struggling with this and grappling with this, like why do I believe these things and not others? And so she takes that in a kind of analytic direction that I'm not particularly concerned with, but I think this is a great example of why the language of genealogy is so prevalent today, because it's on the one hand a challenge to the liberal autonomous subject, the self-creating subject. At the same time, it is an expression of what so many in the developed world feel, which is that what's wrong with the world is not our own moral choices, because we're basically all good people. It's these structures that we've inherited that weigh us down, constrain our action. And so both of those dimensions of genealogy, I think, are pretty prominent in the cultural imagination today.
I would say we can wrap up soon, but I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, which is, to what extent is genealogy an instrument of conflict as well as sort of reconciliation? And again, I would take the example of modern Salafist in the Islamic world, who invoke parallels with the earlier, the rightly ordered caliphates, and claim to be the bearers of that tradition, or not even to be part of a tradition, because I want to hold that word in contrast. These Salafists are actually modernizers in most ways, and in fact model a lot of their activity after revolutionary vanguards in very modern forms, like the communist or even the National Socialist vanguards, political vanguards. And the traditionalists in Islam are really trying to oppose these Salafists who are invoking these parallels and genealogies with ancient earlier Islam. And it's a war of sort of their traditionalism against this invention of sort of a tradition that the Salafists do. So, I mean, do you see, and do people working in your project look at the conflicts of genealogical use as well as the sort of positive uses? I mean, does genealogy lend itself as much to conflict as to reconciliation?
No, I don't think it lends itself as much to conflict as to reconciliation, but obviously, what is it that critical genealogy is doing? It's typically trying to debunk fictional genealogies that have been constructed out of some kind of will to power. And we see ample examples of this in history, especially during periods of monarchies, where you really can gain a lot by constructing a false genealogy. But what those are constantly trying to do is you can't just like make it up out of nowhere. They're constantly looking at the tissues of what is real and exists and seeing where can we kind of forge allegiances and find affinities and alliances. Sometimes it's just in the sound of a name. We've got part of the podcast is about the Steward family with a D, who just used the sound of their name as the basis for a fabricated genealogy to align themselves with the Stuart monarch family in England, and it was successful. And so you can see how that could generate it generated plenty of conflict and controversy because you had people challenging it and so on. But the way it worked was through affinity. It didn't work through like a challenge to someone's legitimacy. It was just fabricating a new legitimacy. So I think what you're dealing with in the case of Salafism is within that tradition, there's going to be a battle over whose genealogy is the right genealogy, and that's going to be one that just comes down to critical history. Going to be doing that gray archival work that Foucault talks about, that characterizes the genealogist. It's going to be meticulous, and you're going to have to agree on have some kind of agreement on archives and so on. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you very much for introducing many of us to a new whole approach of inquiry in the humanities and beyond social sciences. And it was a very illuminating talk. And I want to thank all the participants in today's noon discussion. I invite you to return when we have our next one, date of which we have not yet established. But I also encourage you to read and subscribe to the Hedgehog Review. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks everybody for coming.